You know, in the world of diabetes, you hear this term that sounds almost too good to be true, right? The honeymoon period. It sounds like a happy ending right at the start. But honestly, it can be a huge source of confusion, even a little bit of false hope. So today, let's unpack what's really going on behind that optimistic name.
So, what is it? Is it some kind of miracle recovery? A sign that the diabetes is just going away for good? Or is it more of a medical mirage? That's the big question we're going to tackle right now. All right, so to get to the bottom of that mirage question, we've got to first understand what this phase is. And really, at its core, you can think of it as a temporary reprieve. So here's the clinical definition. The words you really need to focus on here are temporary and partial. Basically, it means your blood sugar control gets way better. And this is the super important part. Your need for insulin is reduced. It's not gone, just reduced. So it's like a brief break from the full burden of the disease, but it is absolutely not a cure. Okay, so you're probably wondering, when does this thing even start? Well, it usually kicks in a few weeks or maybe a few months after someone starts their insulin treatment. But here's the tricky part. The timeline is all over the place. It could be over in just a few weeks, or for some people, it can stretch out for a whole year, maybe even two. It's really unpredictable. You know, to really get what's happening on a biological level, without getting lost in all the technical jargon, let's use a simple analogy. It's a great way to picture it. Just think of the pancreas as a fading battery. Yeah, exactly. Just picture a kid's toy, one that runs on batteries. And you notice it's starting to slow down, the lights are getting dim. That's a perfect way to think about the pancreas as it starts to struggle right before a diabetes diagnosis. So let's walk through this. First, the toy slows down, right? That's the onset of diabetes. The body's insulin-producing cells are under attack. Then, what do you do with a toy like that? You turn it off for a bit. You let it last. Well, that's exactly like starting insulin treatment. It takes all the pressure off the pancreas. And when you switch that toy back on, surprise, you get this little burst of energy. It seems like it's working again. That is the honeymoon period. But we all know what happens next. Eventually, that last bit of power drains away, and the battery is just done. So what's actually happening inside the body during that restart? Well, when you start taking external insulin, the few pancreatic cells that are still hanging on get a much-needed break. They're not being overworked anymore. So they kind of rally, They start producing small amounts of insulin on their own again. And that's exactly why you suddenly need less injected insulin. It all makes sense when you think of it that way. But please, this is maybe the single most important thing to understand. That underlying autoimmune attack, it hasn't stopped. It's still happening. So even though things seem to be getting better on the surface, the disease is quietly progressing in the background. Okay, so a logical question pops up here, right? Who does this actually affect? Does everyone with diabetes go through this so-called honeymoon period? And the answer to that is a very, very clear no. First, let's get some quick context, because this is super important. The vast, vast majority of diabetes cases, we're talking 90 to 95%, are type 2. That smaller slice of the pie, just about 5 to 10%, is type 1. And that difference is everything when it comes to understanding the honeymoon period. And here's the bottom line. This whole phase, it only happens in the autoimmune forms of diabetes. That means type 1 and another related form called LADA. It never, and I mean never, happens in type 2 diabetes. The reason is simple. The cause of the disease is just completely different. Now, look, needing less insulin sounds amazing, right? It sounds like great news. But, and this is a big but, this phase can actually introduce a pretty significant hidden danger. It's why managing this period requires working really, really closely with your doctor and your healthcare team. So what is this danger? The number one risk, without a doubt, is hypoglycemia. That means dangerously low blood sugar. And believe me, it is a very serious and very immediate concern. So how does that even happen? Well, think about it. The body has suddenly started making a little bit of its own insulin again. At the same time, the person is still injecting their regular dose of external insulin. If you don't adjust that injected dose way down, the combined total becomes way too high. And the result, blood sugar can absolutely plummet. And that's a dangerous situation. Okay, so we have covered a lot of ground here. Let's boil this all down to the key things you absolutely need to remember. All right, here's your quick summary. Number 1, this is temporary. It is not a cure. Number 2, it only happens in type 1 and LADA diabetes, period. Number 3, that autoimmune process, it's still going.
4, the biggest, most immediate risk is low blood sugar, hypoglycemia. And number 5, sooner or later, this phase always ends. So look, we've established it's not a cure, but that doesn't mean it isn't valuable. It's actually a unique window of opportunity. It's a time when you have a bit more stability, when you need less insulin, and that raises a really important final question, right? Knowing that it's temporary, how can you use this phase wisely? How can you navigate it to build good habits and establish great control that will set you up for better health in the long run? Something to think about. Thanks so much for joining me for this.